The well rope came up with nothing but the wet end dripping into the dust. Clara Bowen stood there a moment longer than she needed to, the empty bucket swinging at the end of the line, listening to the way the wind moved through the dry grass on the ridge. It was not a sound that promised mercy. She had been on this claim in the Nebraska sandhills for 6 years, and she had learned to read the wind the way other women read scripture. This one came from the southwest, steady and hot, and it told her that the garden she had planted with such hope in April would be baked to nothing by July if something did not change. The garden was all she had left that mattered. Her husband Jacob had been gone 2 years come autumn, taken by the fever that swept through the settlement that terrible year. The house he had built for her stood solid enough, but it felt hollow without his voice in it. The land he had broken with his own hands, 160 acres of rolling sandhill country that grew mostly buffalo grass and the occasional stunted cottonwood along the creek, had given them just enough to live on in the good years and not nearly enough in the bad. After Jacob died, Clara had kept the place going out of pure stubbornness, and because she had nowhere else to go. She had no people left in Ohio, and the thought of returning to the life she had left behind, the life of a milliner's daughter in a tidy brick house, felt like a kind of death worse than the one she was already living. So she stayed. She kept 12 chickens, a milk cow named Bess, and a vegetable garden that was the pride and the torment of her days. The garden was her answer to the loneliness. When she worked the soil, she did not think about the empty chair at the supper table. When she watched the first green shoots break through the ground, she felt something close to peace. But the garden required water, and water in the sandhills in a dry year was a thing you had to wrestle from the earth with your own 2 hands. The creek that ran along the border of her claim had been low for weeks. The spring rains had come and gone in a matter of days, leaving the ground damp on the surface and bone dry an inch down. Clara had been hauling water up from the creek twice a day, morning and evening, bucket by bucket, her shoulders aching as she carried the sloshing weight up the slope to the garden. She had done it long enough now that she could feel the strain in her back even when she was standing still. The garden was not responding to all that labor the way it ought to. The bean vines looked thin and pale. The squash blossoms had started to drop without setting fruit. The tomatoes that she had coddled through the cold nights of May were turning yellow at the edges. And the weeds, the cursed pigweed and lamb's quarters, came up thick and fast, drinking what little moisture the soil held before the vegetables could get to it. Clara had spent that morning on her knees in the dirt, pulling weeds until her fingernails were black and her knees were sore, and the garden still looked like a losing battle. She had straightened up and looked at the sky, which was a pale, hot blue with no cloud in it, and she had felt something give way inside her. Not hope, exactly, something smaller than that. The willingness to keep fighting the same losing fight day after day. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier. Stories of women like Clara Bowen, who were laughed at and looked down upon, who had no wealth and no powerful friends, but who found a way to turn the very things that others discarded into the stuff of survival. These are the tales that the history books leave out, the quiet triumphs that happen far from the railroad and the telegraph line, in the lonely places where a person had only their own wits and their own 2 hands to depend on. Clara Bowen was such a woman, and her story begins on that hot morning with an empty bucket and a heart that was too tired to cry. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. For Clara Bowen, the fire of her own endurance was burning low, but it had not gone out. And the moment that would change everything was already moving toward her, though she did not know it yet. She hung the empty bucket back on its hook by the well and walked to the garden to see what the morning had done to her beans. The wind was picking up now, riffling the leaves of the cottonwood by the creek, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass. It was the smell of a summer that was going to be hard. Clara had grown up in Ohio, where the summers were soft and green, where you could stick your hand into the soil and feel the dampness 6 inches down without any trouble at all. The sandhills were not Ohio. The topsoil here was thin and sandy, and it let the water run right through it. You could pour a bucket of water onto a row of beans and watch it soak in and disappear, and an hour later, the ground would be dry again on the surface. Clara had tried everything she knew to hold the moisture in. She had mulched with straw, but the wind blew it away. She had laid down old burlap sacks, but they rotted and tore and did not do much good. She had dug shallow trenches to catch the water, but the sandy soil would not hold the shape of the trench. The garden was slowly dying, and she was dying with it, a little bit each day. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of June, something happened that turned everything. Clara had ridden the 6 miles to the town of Broken Bow to pick up the mail and trade a few eggs for sugar and salt. The town was small and dusty, with a single main street lined with false front buildings and hitching rails. It was not the kind of place where a woman alone drew much attention, but it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Clara did her errands quickly, keeping her head down, and was about to ride home when she saw a wagon pulled up in front of the blacksmith shop. The wagon was loaded with something strange, something that made her pull Bess to a stop and stare. The wagon bed was piled high with what looked like great gray bales of dirty wool, but it was not sheep wool, it was buffalo wool, the long, coarse, matted hair that had been shorn from the hides of the great herds that were being slaughtered on the plains to the west. Clara had seen buffalo robes before, but she had never seen the raw wool from the animals, the stuff that was too coarse and dirty to be of any use for spinning. The blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of maybe 16 named Sam, was standing beside the wagon, looking at the load with a sour expression. Clara dismounted and walked over. Sam nodded at her, not quite meeting her eyes. "Heard about these?" he said, jerking his head at the wagon. "The railroad brought 'em in. Some fella out west sheared a pile of buffalo hides and thought he could sell the wool for something. But nobody wants it. Too coarse. Too full of burrs and dirt. The railroad won't ship it back, so they dumped it here. Blacksmith's been trying to figure out what to do with it. Burn it, likely." Clara walked up to the wagon and laid her hand on the topmost bale. The wool was rough and greasy, smelling of animal and dust and prairie grass. It was heavy and matted, but it was also thick as anything she had ever felt. She stood there, her hand on that strange gray mass, and a thought began to form in her mind. It was not a clear thought yet, just a strange, sideways notion, the kind of idea that comes from a place deeper than logic. She thought of the forest floor back in Ohio, the way the fallen leaves lay in a thick blanket over the earth, holding the moisture in, keeping the soil cool even on the hottest days. She thought of the way the garden was dying because the sun and the wind stole the water faster than she could pour it in. She thought of this thick, matted wool, this thing that nobody wanted, this useless thing that the railroad had dumped on the town like garbage. What if she laid it on her garden beds the way the leaves lay on the forest floor? What if it held the water in the way the leaves did? "How much does he want for it?" Clara asked, her voice coming out steady, even though her heart was beating faster. Sam blinked. "For this? I reckon he'd pay you to take it off his hands. Nobody's touched it since it came in." Clara walked into the blacksmith shop and found the blacksmith, a heavy man named Calvin Honeycutt, standing at his forge. She told him she wanted the wagon load of wool. Calvin stared at her as if she had asked to buy a load of rattlesnakes. "What in tarnation for?" he said. "I have a garden," Clara said. "I need to mulch it." Calvin laughed. "Mulch it with buffalo wool? That's the damnedest thing I ever heard. It'll smother your plants. It'll draw every rat in the county. It'll set your garden on fire if it gets dry enough." "If it does, I'll have something to tell the neighbors," Clara said. "What do you want for it?" Calvin shook his head, still laughing. "You can have the whole wagon load for $1 if you take it today. And you'll be sorry you did." Clara gave him $1 from the small coin purse she kept in her apron pocket. She had been saving that $1 for 2 months to buy a new saw blade, but she handed it over without hesitating. She had the feeling that she was stepping off a cliff, that she was about to do something so strange and foolish that her neighbors would talk about it for years. But she had also learned, in the 2 years since Jacob had died, that the safe path was not always the one that led anywhere good. She hitched Bess to the borrowed wagon while Sam loaded the bales onto the flatbed. By the time she started for home, the sun was low in the west, and the long shadows of the cottonwoods stretched across the road. The wind had died down, and the evening was quiet. The only sound the creak of the wagon and the soft plod of Bess's hooves on the dusty track. Clara kept glancing back at the load of wool, trying not to second-guess herself. The laughter of the town was still ringing in her ears. Calvin Honeycutt had told the story to the men loafing in front of the general store before she had even driven the wagon off the street. She had seen them nudge each other and shake their heads. She had heard one of them say, "That Bowen woman has gone plumb crazy," and another had said, "She was always a strange one, living out there alone. It's addled her mind." Clara set her jaw and kept driving. She was used to being the object of talk. It came with the territory of being a widow on a hardscrabble claim in a country where women were supposed to remarry quickly or move back east. But this was different. This was pure foolishness, and she knew it, and she was doing it anyway. The sun was dropping behind the ridge when Clara Bowen finally got the wagon unloaded, the bales of buffalo wool piled in a great gray heap beside the garden. She stood there a moment, breathing hard, her hands already sticky with the grease that coated every fiber. It smelled strong, a wild animal smell that the chickens would have to get used to. She had no plan, just a notion and $1 spent, and a garden that was slowly dying while she stood there trying to decide where to begin. She began at the far end of the bean row because the beans were worst, the leaves already curling at the edges, the stems thin and weak. She took a mattock and broke the wool into chunks, then spread it with her hands, working it loose, laying it down in a rough gray blanket 3 inches deep around the base of each pole. The wool clung to her fingers and stuck to her dress. It was filthy work, and by the time she had covered the first row, she looked as though she had been wrestling a buffalo herself, her arms smeared with grease and dirt, her hair coming loose from its pins. The sun had gone down, and the mosquitoes had come up, and she was too tired to do more. She went inside, washed her hands in the basin, and ate a cold biscuit and a piece of dried apple for supper. She did not sleep well. She lay awake listening to the wind pick up again, a low, steady moan around the eaves, and she kept seeing the gray wool in her mind, wondering whether it was doing any good, or whether she had just wasted $1 and a day's work. In the morning she went out before the sun cleared the ridge, and she found that the wool had settled overnight, flattening slightly under its own weight. The dew had settled on it, beating on the coarse fibers, and when she lifted a corner and put her hand down to the soil beneath, the dirt was damp. Not just damp, cool. Cool and dark and holding, the way the forest floor held its moisture through a dry spell. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of beans. They looked the same as they had the day before, maybe a little less wilted. It was too soon to tell. But the soil under the wool was a different thing altogether. She had never felt that kind of dampness in her garden in the middle of June, not once in 6 years. She covered the rest of the bean rows that morning, and then the squash bed, and then the tomatoes. By noon she had laid wool over every vegetable she owned, and the garden looked like a strange gray patchwork, as though the earth had grown a pelt. She stood back and looked at it, and she had to admit it was an ugly sight. The wool was uneven and lumpy, full of burrs and bits of dried dung. It smelled like a barnyard. It looked like a mistake, but the soil beneath it was cool, and that was something she could not argue with. Word traveled fast in a country where there was little else to talk about. By the end of the week, Clara's garden had become the chief curiosity of the township. The first visitor was Martha Gunderson, who lived 2 miles east and considered herself the arbiter of all domestic matters in the neighborhood. Martha arrived on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a cup of sugar, but Clara knew better. Martha's eyes went straight to the garden the moment she stepped off the porch, and her mouth took on a tight, compressed look that Clara had learned to read as disapproval in its most refined form. "Clara Bowen," Martha said, "what in heaven's name have you done to your garden?" Clara explained as plainly as she could about the wool, about the forest floor, about holding moisture. Martha listened with her arms crossed, and when Clara finished, Martha let out a short laugh, not a kind one. "Buffalo wool," she said, as if tasting the words. "Well, I've heard of such things as a last resort, I suppose, but it'll sour your soil. It'll breed pests. And it looks like a pack of wild animals died in your bean rows." "It might," Clara said. "It might not. I figure it's worth trying." Martha sniffed. "I'll be interested to see how it turns out, though I can't say I'm holding my breath." She took the sugar and left, but not before giving the garden one last dismissive look. That was the beginning. Over the next several days, Clara saw the look repeated on the faces of everyone who happened to ride past her claim. The Pruitt boys, who lived a mile to the north, made a detour on their way to town just to gawk. They did not say anything, just slowed their horses and stared, and then one of them cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a long, mocking moo, as if she were some strange creature in a pen. The widow Doone, a hard old woman who had buried 2 husbands and a son, and who lived alone on a rocky piece of ground to the west, came by on her way back from town and stood at the fence for a full 5 minutes without saying a word. Clara came out to greet her, but the widow just shook her head and turned her horse and rode off without speaking. That silence was worse than Martha's laughter. The schoolteacher, a thin, nervous man named Ephraim Abernathy, who kept a small garden behind his boarding house, made a point of stopping Clara on the road the next Sunday after services. He took her aside, his voice low and earnest, and told her that he had heard about her experiment, and he feared for her reputation. "People are talking, Mrs. Bowen," he said. "They say you've lost your senses. They say you're letting your place go to ruin. I don't believe that, of course, but I do think you might consider what sort of example you're setting for the younger women in the community." Clara thanked him for his concern and told him she appreciated his kind thoughts, but she did not promise to stop. She went home and looked at her garden, and for a moment the gray wool seemed to cover everything, not just the soil but her hope, too, muffling it under a weight of doubt. But she had promised herself she would give it a month, and she had never been one to break a promise. She kept watering. The creek was still running, though lower than she liked, and she hauled her buckets up the slope twice a day, morning and evening. But she noticed something within the first week. The wool-covered rows needed less water. The soil stayed moist for a full day after a watering, sometimes longer. The bare patches of ground between the rows, where she had not laid any wool at all, dried out within hours. She started watering the wool rows only once a day, and still the soil stayed damp. She saved herself an hour of hauling every morning, and she used that hour to do the things she had been letting slide: mending the fence, patching the roof of the chicken coop, digging the weeds out of the paths. The weeds themselves were another surprise. On the bare patches, the pigweed and lamb's quarters came up thick, the way they always did, and she spent her usual time bent over, pulling them. But under the wool, nothing grew. The mat was too thick and too heavy for anything to push through. She had not weeded the bean rows or the squash bed in 4 days, and when she finally lifted a corner of the wool to check, she found the soil clean and dark, with only an occasional thin white root trying to find its way out of the dark. She put the wool back and sat down on the ground, suddenly dizzy with the relief of it. All those hours of weeding, month after month, year after year, and here was something that simply stopped them. By the 3rd week, the difference between Clara's garden and everyone else's was starting to show in the crop itself. The beans were climbing their poles with a vigor she had never seen in a dry year. The squash put out leaves the size of dinner plates, deep green and glossy. The tomatoes, which had been yellowing and dropping blossoms in the heat, perked up and began to set fruit, the little green globes forming on the branches as if they had never known hardship. Clara walked through her rows every evening, touching the leaves, counting the blossoms, and she began to believe that the wool was doing something real. She did not crow about it. She told no one except her horse, Bess, who listened with patient ears while Clara talked through her theories out loud. But the garden was speaking for itself. By the 1st of July, the crops in the neighbors' gardens were stunted and pale. The drought had settled in now in earnest. The creek had dropped to a brown trickle, and the grass on the hills had gone from green to yellow to a brittle beige that crackled underfoot. Martha Gunderson's garden was a sorry sight, the beans yellow and the squash blossoms turning brown without setting. The widow Doone's place was even worse. Her corn had not even reached knee-high before it started to curl and fire at the tips. Ephraim Abernathy's kitchen garden had given up completely, the tomato plants reduced to blackened sticks. But Clara's garden was green, not perfectly green, not lush the way it would be in a wet year, but green. The beans were bearing heavily enough that she had started picking them daily and drying them on sheets on the porch. The squash were so abundant that she had given a basketful to the widow Doone, who had accepted them with a hard stare and a curt nod that did not quite hide the relief in her eyes. The rumor started small, the way such things do. Someone said that Clara Bowen's garden could not possibly be doing as well as it looked, that she must be carrying water from some secret well, that there was something unnatural about it. The muttering grew into a low background hum of suspicion. Clara heard it in town when she went to trade eggs for flour. The clerk at the general store, a man named Miles, asked her outright whether she was using some kind of witchcraft on her garden, and when she laughed and said no, he looked at her sideways, as if he did not believe her. The worst of it came on a Sunday in mid-July, after services. Ephraim Abernathy stood up on the church steps, in front of nearly the whole congregation, and announced that he had been thinking about the matter of Mrs. Bowen's garden. He cleared his throat and said that while he did not wish to accuse anyone, he had heard that the wool Clara was using had come from the same lot that the railroad had dumped, and that the railroad had reported that wool had been treated with a chemical to keep the moths out, and that chemical might be poisoning the soil and might even be harmful to the people who ate the vegetables grown in it. Clara stood in the crowd, her face burning. She had not heard any such report from the railroad. She had heard nothing of the sort. But the schoolteacher was a respected man, and when he spoke, people listened. A murmur ran through the congregation. Martha Gunderson turned to look at Clara, and her eyes were sharp with something that was almost triumph. Clara forced herself to speak calmly. She said that she had washed the wool before using it, that she had seen no sign of any chemical, and that her own health and the health of everyone who had eaten her vegetables was perfectly fine. She invited anyone who doubted to come and see the garden for themselves, to dig down with their own hands and feel the soil. Ephraim Abernathy smiled a thin, tight smile and said that he was sure Mrs. Bowen meant well, but that it was his duty to caution the community, and he would leave it to each individual to make up their own mind. The congregation dispersed in small, whispering groups. Clara walked home alone, her feet heavy on the dusty road. That night, she went out to the garden in the dark. The moon was up, a thin crescent that gave just enough light to see the gray shapes of the wool-covered beds. She knelt at the edge of the tomato row and pushed her hand through the wool into the soil beneath. It was cool and damp and alive. She brought a handful of the dark dirt up to her face and smelled it, the good, earthy smell of a garden that was thriving, and she held it in her palm for a long time, trying to let that truth be enough. But the doubt was there too, creeping in around the edges. What if the schoolteacher was right? What if the wool was doing something wrong, something she could not see? She had no book to consult, no expert to ask. She had only her own observation and her own hope, and hope was a thin defense against a whole community's whispers. The days that followed were the hardest of her life on that claim. Every time she went to town, she felt the eyes on her. The talk had spread beyond the church, beyond the neighborhood, into every corner of the settlement. She was the woman with the buffalo garden, the queer creature who had covered her vegetables in animal hair and was probably poisoning the town with her produce. The Pritts refused to trade with her. Martha Gunderson sent back the basket of squash Clara had given her, with a note saying she would prefer not to take any chances. Even the widow Doone, who had accepted Clara's gift with such hungry eyes, now avoided her on the road. Clara hauled water, tended her garden, and tried not to let the loneliness swallow her whole. The garden itself did not care about the rumors. The garden kept growing. The tomatoes ripened into heavy red globes, the beans produced by the pound, the squash spread across the beds like green waves. Clara canned and dried and stored, filling her cellar with jars and bags until the shelves groaned under the weight of the harvest. She had enough food to last her through 2 winters, maybe 3. But she could not give it away anymore. No one would take it. And the isolation, the deep, aching isolation of being the one that everyone was talking about, settled into her bones like a cold that would not leave. She wrote to her father in Ohio, a long letter telling him everything, the wool and the garden and the laughter and the accusations. She waited 3 weeks for his reply. When it came, the letter was short, for he had never been much of a writer. But one line stood out. You always saw worth in what other people threw away. That don't change just because other people don't see it. Clara read that line 3 times, folded the letter, and put it in the pocket of her apron. She went out into the garden that evening, and the wind was blowing hot from the south, the same dry wind that had been blowing for weeks. The wool on the beds had begun to crust on the surface, a pale gray crust that cracked when she touched it. She pushed down through it into the soil, and the soil was still damp, still cool. The garden was holding. She was holding. And the wind kept blowing. The wind did not stop. It was the second week of August now, and the country had turned the color of bone. The creek was a string of mud puddles. The grass on the hills had cured to a dry straw that rustled and crackled with every gust. The sky was a pale, hot white, as if the blue had burned out of it. Clara's garden was still the greenest spot for miles, but she could see the edges of it starting to brown. The wool was not failing, but the wind was testing it the way a blacksmith tests a blade, pushing harder and harder until something gives. The younger generation of the town had taken to riding past her place in the evenings, whooping and hollering and calling out things she tried not to hear. She stayed inside when she could, but the garden needed her. She watered from the last deep pool in the creek, hauling buckets up the steep bank, her shoulders screaming, her hands raw. She did it twice a day, and still the beans began to droop at midday. She moved the watering to dawn, before the wind woke, and it helped a little. She pressed the wool down flat against the soil to close the gaps the wind had opened, and it helped a little, but it was not enough. And then, on a Thursday evening in the third week of August, the wind did what everybody in the country had been afraid it would do. It picked up a spark from somewhere, a campfire, a lightning strike, a careless hand. And it drove that spark into the dry grass on the far side of the Showalter place, and the grass went up like a fuse. Clara saw the smoke on the horizon just before sunset, a great brown column rising straight up before the wind caught it and bent it east toward the settlement, toward her. She stood on the porch and watched it grow, and she felt the cold hand of fear close around her throat. The fire was coming, and the garden, her stubborn, foolish, wool-covered garden, was in its path. She did not know whether the wool would burn. She did not know whether she could save what she had worked for all summer. She only knew that she could not stand by and let it burn. She ran for the plow. The smoke on the horizon was not a single column, but a spreading stain, low and wide, the color of old blood in the fading light. Clara ran for the plow where it leaned against the side of the barn, the handles worn smooth by Jacob's hands and her own. She did not stop to think about the odds. She did not stop to calculate how far the fire was or how fast the wind would bring it. She simply took hold of the plow and dragged it toward the garden, because doing something, even something useless, was better than standing still and watching the flames devour everything she had built. The plow was a walking plow, a single-bladed thing meant for turning sod, not for cutting fire breaks. Clara had used it often enough to know its weight and its moods. She set the blade into the dry earth at the western edge of the garden, where the grass stretched away toward the burning horizon, and she leaned into the handles with all her weight. The blade bit into the ground and turned a thin ribbon of pale soil, no more than a handspan wide. It was pitifully small against what was coming, but she kept going. She walked the plow along the edge of the garden, turning a furrow that would be her only defense. The wind was hot on her face now, carrying the smell of smoke and the faint crackling sound of distant flame. She did not look up. She did not let herself measure how much of the sky the smoke had swallowed. She just kept walking, one step after another, the plow blade scraping through the dry earth, leaving a thin line of hope behind her. By the time the first stars should have been visible, the sky was a solid wall of brown and orange to the west. The fire had grown. It was not a distant threat anymore. It was a living thing, a wall of flame that stretched from the southern ridge to the northern horizon, and it was moving fast, driven by the wind that had not let up all summer. Clara had circled the garden with a single furrow. She went around a second time, widening the break, turning a second ribbon of bare earth beside the first. The blade caught on a root, and she stumbled, nearly falling, but she caught herself and kept going. Her hands were blistered, her back screaming, her eyes watering from the smoke that was thickening in the air. She was not going to save the garden with a furrow 2 inches deep. She knew that. The fire would leap across it like a child jumping a puddle. But she could not stop. She could not stand still and watch it burn. Eli Showalter found her there, half blind with smoke and exhaustion, still pushing the plow along the third furrow. He rode up out of the darkness with a wet sack tied across the back of his horse, his face black with soot, his eyes wild. "Clara!" he shouted, reining in. "Get away from here! The fire's jumped the creek! It's coming straight for us!" Clara did not stop pushing the plow. "I know," she said. "I can see it." Eli stared at her for a moment, then dismounted and grabbed the other handle of the plow. He did not say anything. He just put his weight beside hers, and together they finished the third furrow, then a fourth, turning a strip of bare earth 4 feet wide around the garden. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The fire was close now. Clara could hear it clearly, a deep, hungry roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sky above them was orange, the color of a forge, and the heat pressed against her face like an open oven door. The grass on the far side of the road caught with a sound like a sigh, and then the flames were running along the fence line, and she could see the shapes of the neighbor men on the road, beating at the edges of the fire with wet sacks and horse blankets, trying to keep it from spreading to the homesteads farther east. One of the figures broke away and ran toward her. It was Ephraim Abernathy, his white shirt smudged with ash, his face twisted with urgency and something else, something that might have been fright. "Mrs. Bowen," he shouted, "you need to get out. The fire's going to take everything. There's no stopping it now." Clara looked at the garden behind her, the gray wool-covered beds that had been the target of so much mockery, the vegetables that had sustained her through the loneliest summer of her life. She did not run. She turned to Eli and said, "Get me a wet blanket, as big as you can find." Eli hesitated, then ran for the house. He came back with the heavy wool blanket from her bed, already soaked in the last of the water from the barrel by the door. Clara took it and walked to the western edge of the garden, where the furrow she had plowed lay pale and bare against the dark grass beyond. She dropped the wet blanket on the ground, spreading it flat just beyond the furrow. Then she walked to the edge of the garden and knelt. She lifted a corner of the buffalo wool that covered the squash bed. It was dry on top, but beneath, where it touched the soil, it was still damp, still holding the moisture she had given it over the long weeks. She pulled up a great armful of the wool, heavy with the weight of the damp soil clinging to it, and she carried it to the wet blanket and laid it on top. She went back for more, armful after armful, while the fire roared closer and the heat grew unbearable. Eli and Ephraim stood watching her, too stunned to help at first. Then Eli understood. He grabbed a handful of the wool and began to spread it beside hers, building a wet barrier along the edge of the garden, the wool that nobody wanted, the wool that had been laughed at, now being used as a shield against the fire. They worked together, the three of them, in the hellish orange light, as the fire reached the fence and began to eat the posts one by one. Clara could feel the heat on her back, could smell her own hair beginning to singe, but she did not stop. She kept pulling the wool from the beds, piling it along the edge of the garden, wetting it down with water that Ephraim brought in buckets from the creek. The fire reached the furrow. It paused there, licking at the bare earth, finding nothing to feed on. Then it found the wool. The outer edges of the piled wool began to smolder, to curl and blacken, but they did not burst into flame. They were too wet, too thick, too matted with moisture and soil. The fire crawled along the edge of the wool, seeking a way through, and found none. It cracked and hissed and threw up a column of bitter smoke, and then it began to move sideways, following the path of the grass along the fence line, looking for an easier way. The garden was a green island in a sea of flame. The fire did not take it. It circled around, driven by the wind and the wet barrier that Clara had built from the very thing the town had mocked. It took the grass to the north and east, took a corner of the barn roof, took the chicken coop before anyone could stop it, but the garden stood. When the sun rose the next morning through a sky the color of ash, Clara sat on the edge of the porch, too tired to stand, too grateful to speak. The garden was gray with soot, the wool crusted with a fine layer of ash, but when she walked out to the nearest bed and lifted the top layer, the soil beneath was cool and damp, and the bean vines were still green, their leaves unfurled to the pale, smoke-dimmed light. Eli came by with the other men who had fought the fire through the night. They stood at the edge of the garden, black-faced and hollow-eyed, looking at the green that should not have been there. The fire had taken the grazing on the Showalter place. It had burned through the Widow Dunes pasture and stopped 100 yards from her house, only because the wind shifted at the last minute. It had scorched the edges of the town itself, leaving a blackened ring around the settlement like a wound. And here, at the heart of the strangest garden in the territory, the vegetables were still alive. Ephraim Abernathy walked slowly along the edge of the garden, his hands behind his back, his eyes moving from the green beans to the wool, to Clara. He stopped at the spot where the wool had been piled against the fire. The outer layers were charred, black, and crumbling, but beneath, the wool was still wet, still holding the soil against the heat. He reached down and pushed his finger through the wool into the earth beneath. When he straightened, his face was different. The pride and the suspicion had gone out of it, and what remained was something quieter, something that looked like shame. "It held the fire," he said. "It was not a question. It held the water," Clara said. "I reckon it'll hold a lot of things." Ephraim nodded slowly. He did not apologize, not then, but he stayed and helped her carry new water from the creek to re-wet the beds, and he did not say a word against the wool for the rest of that day. The news of the fire and of Clara Bowen's garden traveled faster than the flames had. By the time the smoke had cleared and the wind had finally died, the whole county knew that the strange gray blanket the widow Bowen had laid on her garden had saved it from a fire that swept through everything else. They knew because they saw the garden still standing when they rode past, and they saw her giving away vegetables to families who had lost everything. The widow Dune, who had avoided Clara for weeks, came to the door with a bucket of milk in her hand and a look on her face that was as close to apology as the old woman ever came. "I might have been hasty," she said, and left the milk on the step without another word. Clara took the milk inside and poured it into a pitcher, and she felt something in her chest loosen, a knot she had not known she was carrying. The garden was still there. The garden was safe. And the people who had laughed at her were beginning to understand that she had been right all along. The weeks after the fire brought a strange new quiet to Clara Bowen's life. The wind that had blown without mercy all summer finally laid down in the first days of September, and the air grew still and heavy, as if the earth itself was catching its breath. The smoke cleared, leaving a landscape blackened and raw. The hills that had been golden with cured grass were now a dark expanse of ash, with only the occasional charred stump or fence post to mark where the fire had passed. The creek, which had been a string of muddy pools before the fire, now ran with a thin trickle of water stained gray with ash. Every drop counted. Clara's garden had survived. The outer edges of the wool that had been piled against the fire were black and crumbling, but the beds themselves were intact. The wool had done what she had hoped, and then some. It had held the water through the worst drought in the memory of the oldest settler. It had held the fire at bay. And now, as the summer heat began to taper into the cooler days of early autumn, it continued to hold the moisture that the soil needed to keep the vegetables alive. Clara harvested beans by the basketful, squash that seemed to grow bigger overnight, tomatoes that ripened to a deep red even as the leaves on the nearby cottonwoods began to turn yellow. She could not eat it all, and she could not store it all, and so she began to give it away again. But this time, the gifts were not refused. The first knock came from a woman Clara barely knew, a homesteader's wife named Lottie Pruitt, whose husband was the cousin of the Pruitt boys who had mocked Clara from the road. Lottie came to the door with a basket of her own, empty, and a look of exhaustion so deep it seemed to have hollowed out her face. She did not ask outright. She just stood there, looking at the ground, and Clara understood. She filled the basket with squash and tomatoes and a handful of green beans, and Lottie took it with both hands and said, "I don't know how to thank you." And Clara said, "You don't have to." That was the beginning. Over the next week, the trickle became a steady stream. The families who had lost their gardens to the fire or to the drought that had preceded it came to Clara's door with empty hands and hungry eyes. The widow Doone came twice, and each time she left with a sack of vegetables, saying less each time but looking at Clara with something that was no longer suspicion. Ephraim Abernathy came on a Tuesday evening, after the sun had gone down, carrying a small basket of dried apples as a peace offering. He stood on the porch and cleared his throat twice before he managed to speak. "I have been doing some reading," he said, "on the subject of mulching. There are records from the old country, from Scotland and Ireland, where they used a similar method with peat and heather. I had not known about it." He paused. "I spoke out of turn. I allowed my own ignorance to damage your reputation, and I am sorry for it." Clara accepted the apology as graciously as she could. She gave him a basket of tomatoes and a cabbage, and she watched him walk away into the twilight with his head down, and she felt something shift inside her. The loneliness of the summer had been real, but the vindication, even partial, was sweet in its own way. The garden kept producing through September and into October. The first frost came late, on the 15th of October, a gentle frost that silvered the wool on the beds and turned the last of the squash leaves black. But the root vegetables, the carrots and turnips and parsnips, were still safe under the blanket of wool, and Clara dug them up well into November, long after every other garden in the county had been harvested or abandoned. By the time winter settled in earnest, Clara Bowen had enough food in her cellar to feed herself twice over, and she had given away more than she had kept. The neighbors who had laughed at her in June were now the neighbors who came to her for advice. She showed them how to lay the wool, how thick to make it, how to keep the collar of bare soil at the stem to prevent rot. She explained that the wool was not just a mulch, that it was slowly breaking down, feeding the soil, turning into the kind of rich humus that she had only ever seen in the forests of Ohio. She told them to collect the wool from the railroad, from the buffalo hunters, from any source they could find, because in the sandhills, where the soil was thin and the wind was cruel, a blanket of coarse, unwanted wool might be the only thing standing between a family and a hungry winter. The winter that followed was a hard one. The snow came early and stayed late, and the temperatures dropped to levels that cracked the water buckets left on the porch. But Clara Bowen's house was warm, her cellar was full, and her heart, which had been so cold and empty through the summer of mockery, had begun to thaw. She did not stop thinking about the wool. She thought about it through the dark months, turning over ideas in her mind. She had seen what it could do in a drought. She had seen what it could do in a fire. She had seen what it could do as a slow mulch, feeding the soil as it rotted. But she had also seen something else. She had seen the way the wool had held the fire at the edge of her garden, dampened and heavy, refusing to burn. And she had begun to wonder whether there was more to the wool than simply keeping the ground moist. She remembered the smell of it, the greasy, lanolin-rich smell that clung to her hands for days after she had handled it. And she remembered the way the fire had crawled along the edge of the piled wool and then turned away, unable to catch. In the long evenings of January, sitting by the stove with a copy of the Farmer's Almanac and a stack of old newspapers that had been used to wrap store purchases, Clara began to piece together a larger understanding. She read about the properties of wool, about the lanolin that made it water-resistant, about the way it matted together to form a barrier that was both breathable and insulating. She read about the ancient farmers of the Scottish Highlands who had used sheep's wool as a soil amendment, burying it in the ground to rot and feed the crops. And she began to see that what she had stumbled upon was not just a trick, not just a desperate measure for a dry year, but something older and deeper, a piece of knowledge that had been practiced for centuries and then forgotten. She wrote a letter to her father telling him about her discoveries. She wrote another letter to the Agricultural College in Lincoln describing her methods and asking for information. She received a brief reply from a professor who expressed polite interest, but made it clear that he did not consider the use of buffalo wool to be a serious subject of study. She did not let that discourage her. She had learned, over the course of that summer, that the opinion of experts was not always worth more than the evidence of her own hands. By February, the first signs of spring were stirring beneath the snow. Clara began to plan her garden for the coming year. She had saved the best of her seeds, and she had a new supply of buffalo wool waiting for her, the railroad having dumped another load in Broken Bow in the fall. She had also gained something else, a reputation. The people in the settlement no longer laughed at her when her name came up. They nodded, a little sheepishly, and said that Clara Bowen had done something remarkable with her garden, and that maybe there was something to that wool business after all. The conversion was not universal. Martha Gunderson still held out, insisting that it was luck, that the fire had missed the garden by chance, that the drought had broken just in time. But even Martha had begun to quiet her criticism, because the evidence was piling up. The families who had taken Clara's advice and laid wool on their gardens the previous fall were reporting that their soil was softer, their spring tilling easier. The wool had not only held the water, it had improved the texture of the ground itself. The worst of the mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging respect that Clara found more uncomfortable than the laughter had been. She was no longer the strange widow with the buffalo garden. She was the woman who had been right, and that, in its own way, was the hardest thing to carry, because now the neighbors came to her not just for vegetables, but for answers. They wanted to know how much wool to buy, what kind, where to store it. They asked her to inspect their soil, to tell them whether they were laying it thick enough. They looked to her as an authority, and Clara did not feel like an authority. She felt like a woman who had tried a desperate thing and gotten lucky, and the weight of that responsibility, of being the one everyone turned to, settled onto her shoulders as heavily as the loneliness had. She woke one night in late February from a dream in which the fire had come again, and this time the wool had not stopped it. She lay in the dark, her heart pounding, and she told herself that the fear was just the memory of the smoke, that the garden was safe, that the wool had proven itself. But the doubt, the old familiar doubt, was still there, sleeping in the corner of her mind, waiting for the next test. And the test, when it came, was not a drought or a fire. It was a flood. The snow melted fast in March, faster than anyone had expected. A warm rain came on the heels of a Chinook wind, and the frozen ground could not absorb the water. The creek, which had been a mere thread for so long, swelled into a brown torrent that climbed its banks and spread across the low ground. The road became a river. The fields that had been black with ash turned to dark mud that sucked at the hooves of horses and the wheels of wagons. And Clara Bowen's garden, which sat on a low rise above the creek, became an island. The water rose through the pasture and lapped at the edge of the plowed furrow she had cut the summer before. The wool-covered beds sat in the middle of that island, and Clara watched from the porch as the muddy water crept closer and closer. She had no way to stop it. She could only watch and hope that the wool that had held the drought would also hold the flood. She remembered the way the wool had repelled the fire, the water in it making it damp and heavy. But now there was too much water, and she wondered whether the wool would simply float away, or rot, or smother the plants it was supposed to protect. The water reached the edge of the garden. It pooled in the furrow and began to seep into the wool from the sides. Clara walked out into the rain, her boots sinking into the mud, and knelt at the edge of the nearest bed. She lifted a corner of the wool. The layer that touched the ground was saturated, heavy with water, but the top of the wool was still dry, still loose. The water was not passing through the way it would through bare soil. It was being held, absorbed slowly, distributed through the matted fibers. She pressed her hand into the wool and felt the soil beneath. It was wet, yes, but not waterlogged. The wool was acting like a sponge, taking up the excess moisture, holding it, releasing it slowly into the earth. It was the same principle, she realized, the same principle that had kept the moisture in during the drought. The wool did not discriminate. It held water when there was too little. It absorbed water when there was too much. It was not a trick. It was a truth. She sat back on her heels in the rain, and she began to laugh. The sound of it startled her, a rusty, unpracticed sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She laughed because the wool had done it again. She laughed because she had been so afraid, and the fear had been for nothing. And she laughed because, for the first time in a very long time, she believed that she might actually know what she was doing. The flood receded after 3 days. The creek fell back into its banks, leaving behind a layer of silt and debris. The garden was muddy, the wool matted and heavy, but when the sun came out and the ground began to dry, the wool-covered beds dried faster than the bare ground around them. The soil beneath was dark and crumbly, not the hard, cracked clay that the neighbors found when they went to plant their own gardens. Clara's garden had weathered the flood as it had weathered the drought and the fire. And the neighbors, who had been watching from their own high ground, began to believe. Spring came early that year, as if the land was eager to put the memory of fire and flood behind it. The first warm days arrived in the middle of March, and the snow melted off the hills in a rush of clear water that filled the creek to its banks, and then settled into a steady, gentle flow. The grass began to green on the blackened slopes, a pale fuzz of new growth that spread like a slow breath across the scorched earth. Clara Bowen walked her garden in the soft mornings, turning over the soil with a hand trowel, testing its readiness. The wool that had covered the beds through the winter was still there, matted and dark, half rotted into the ground. When she lifted a section of it, the soil beneath was black and crumbly, rich with the decomposed remains of the fibers, crawling with earthworms that she had never seen in such numbers in her sandy soil. It was a transformation that she could hardly believe, even with her own hands in the dirt. The wool had not just protected the garden through drought, fire, and flood. It had fed the ground. It had turned the thin, hungry sand into something dark and living. She knelt there a long time, running the soil through her fingers, letting it fall back to the earth in a fine shower. She thought about her father's letter, the line that had stayed with her through the hardest months. You always did see worth in what other people threw away. The buffalo wool had been thrown away twice, first by the hunters who had taken the hides and left the carcasses, and then by the railroad that could not sell the coarse fibers. It had been discarded, dismissed, deemed worthless, and here it was, giving life back to the ground that had so nearly died. The news of Clara's garden had spread through the winter, passed from household to household in the way that news traveled in that country, carried by the wind and the wagons and the women who visited one another's kitchens. The flood had sealed it. Everyone had seen the water rise, had watched the low ground disappear under the brown flood, had feared for their own gardens, and everyone had seen Clara's beds emerge from the receding water still green, still growing, as if the flood had been no more than a passing shower. The doubters had no argument left. The fire had been a fluke, some said. The drought had broken just in time. But the flood had been the final test, and the wool had passed it. By the end of March, Clara had received more visitors than she had seen in the entire previous year. They came with wagons and buckets and questions, wanting to see the garden, wanting to know how she had done it, wanting to try it themselves. She showed them the soil, let them put their own hands into the dark, crumbly earth. She explained the thickness, the spacing, the importance of leaving a collar of bare soil around each stem. She answered the same questions over and over until her voice grew hoarse, but she did not mind. The questions were not mocking anymore. They were earnest, hungry, full of the desperation of people who had watched their gardens fail and were looking for anything that might work. The first week of April brought a day so warm and still that Clara took off her wool shawl and hung it on the porch rail. She was working in the garden, turning the remaining wool into the soil, when she heard the rattle of a wagon on the road. She looked up to see Ephraim Abernathy driving a team hitched to a flatbed piled high with bales of gray wool. He stopped at the gate and climbed down, his movements stiff and uncertain. He was wearing his good coat, the one he wore to church, and his hair was slicked down with water. "Mrs. Bowen," he said, removing his hat and holding it in both hands. "I brought you something. The railroad dumped another load in town yesterday. I bought the whole lot. I thought perhaps you could use it for the garden, or distribute it to the families who need it." Clara walked to the gate and looked at the wagon load of wool. It was good wool, thick and coarse, the same kind she had used the year before. She looked at Ephraim's face, at the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, at the way he kept his eyes on the wool instead of meeting hers. "That was a kind thought," she said, "but I have enough for my own garden. There are others who need it more." "I know," Ephraim hesitated. "I thought perhaps you could tell me how to apply it. To my own garden. I thought I might try it this year." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been rehearsing them and was relieved to have them out. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She remembered the Sunday on the church steps, the way he had stood before the congregation and cast doubt on her wool. the way his words had spread through the community like fire through dry grass. She remembered the loneliness of those weeks, the way people had crossed the street to avoid her, the way Martha Gunderson had sent back the basket of squash. And she remembered the night of the fire, the way Ephraim had helped her pile the wet wool along the edge of the garden, the way he had pushed his finger into the soil and looked at her with something like shame. "I'll come by tomorrow," Clara said. "I'll show you how to lay it." Ephraim nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "I would be much obliged." He climbed back onto the wagon and drove away, leaving the load of wool sitting in Clara's yard. She watched him go, and she felt something shift inside her, something that had been clenched tight since the previous summer. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. The next day, Clara hitched Bess to the wagon and drove the load of wool to Ephraim Abernathy's boarding house. He had a small plot behind the house, maybe 30 feet square, where he had tried to grow vegetables the previous year. The soil was thin and sandy, like the rest of the country, and the remnants of his failed garden were still visible, dry stalks and withered leaves poking through the crusted ground. Clara showed him how to break up the wool and spread it, how to wet it down and let it settle before planting. She showed him the proper thickness, the collar around the stems, the way to check the moisture beneath the mat. He listened with the attention of a man who was trying very hard to get something right. When she finished, he stood looking at the gray-covered bed, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders hunched. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a public one. I spoke against you without knowing what I was talking about. I caused harm to your reputation, and I am sorry." Clara considered the words. They were what she had wanted to hear for months, but now that they were here they felt less important than she had expected. The garden had survived without the apology. The wool had done its work regardless of what anyone said. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I think you already made it right. The night of the fire when you helped me pile the wool, that counted for more than words." Ephraim looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment his face lost its nervous tension. "I learned something that night," he said. "I learned that a thing doesn't have to be familiar to be true." Clara nodded. She thought of her father's letter. She thought of the forest floor in Ohio. She thought of all the things she had learned by being willing to look foolish. "That's about the size of it," she said. The spring planting season came on fast after that. Clara worked from dawn until dusk, preparing her beds, planting her seeds, laying the wool with hands that knew the rhythm of the work now, the way the fibers yielded and settled. She had more help this year. Lottie Pruitt came by twice a week, bringing her children, who helped carry water and pull the few weeds that pushed through the wool. The widow Doone appeared one morning with a basket of seedlings she had started in her window, offering them to Clara as a gift. "I don't know why I'm giving them to you," the old woman said, her voice gruff. "You've got more than me." "They'll go in the ground," Clara said, "and they'll come back to you in the harvest." The widow Doone sniffed and turned away, but Clara saw her wipe her eyes as she walked back to her wagon. The garden grew as it had never grown before. The soil that had been fed by the decomposing wool was rich and dark, holding moisture longer, releasing nutrients steadily. The beans climbed their poles with an urgency that seemed almost joyful. The squash put out leaves so broad they cast shade on the ground beneath. The tomatoes set fruit in clusters that bent the branches low. Clara walked through her rows each evening, counting, tending, marveling. She had planted more than she could possibly use, because she knew now that the harvest was not just for her. It was for the neighbors who had laughed, and the neighbors who had believed, for the families who had lost their gardens, and the ones who were just learning to grow their own. By May, the whole settlement had become a laboratory for Clara's method. A dozen gardens wore the gray blanket, and the ones that did not were the exception rather than the rule. Martha Gunderson held out longest, insisting that her own methods, the clean cultivation she had learned from her mother in Illinois, were superior. But by the middle of May, when her beans were yellowing and Clara's were already bearing, Martha sent her husband to ask if Clara would spare a few tips on the wool. Clara sent back a basket of beans and a note that said simply, "Come see for yourself." Martha came the next day. She stood at the edge of Clara's garden, her arms crossed, her face a study in conflicting emotions. She watched Clara lift a corner of the wool and show her the dark, damp soil beneath, the earthworms moving through it, the roots of the vegetables spreading white and healthy. She knelt down, reluctantly, and put her hand into the ground. When she stood up, her hand was dark with rich soil, and she looked at it as if she had never seen dirt before. "All right," she said, "I'll try it." Clara helped her lay the wool on her own garden that same afternoon. They worked side by side. Two women who had spent the previous summer as enemies now bent over the same rows, spreading the same gray fibers. They did not talk much, but the silence was not hostile. It was the silence of work, of two people doing something together that needed to be done. By the time the sun went down, Martha's garden was covered, and Martha herself was standing in the middle of it, looking around as if she were seeing her own land for the first time. "I don't know why I was so set against it," she said. "Pride, I suppose." "That's a hard thing to lay down," Clara said. Martha nodded. She did not say thank you, but she did not have to. The summer that followed was the sweetest Clara had known since coming to the Sandhills. The rain came at regular intervals, gentle rains that soaked deep into the ground. The wind stayed mild, the temperatures moderate, and the gardens of the settlement flourished. The wool-covered beds did better than the others, but even the gardens that had not used the wool did well enough, because the season itself was kind. And Clara found herself, for the first time in years, content. She had her garden, her chickens, her cow. She had neighbors who greeted her on the road instead of crossing to avoid her. She had a reputation, not as a laughingstock, but as the woman who had found a use for the thing everyone else had thrown away. The wool had changed everything, but the true test, the vindication that would seal her legacy in the memory of the community, was still to come. And it came not in a drought or a fire or a flood, but in the form of a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday in late June, a thick envelope with the seal of the Nebraska State Agricultural College on the flap. Clara opened it standing on her porch, the afternoon sun warm on her face, the smell of the garden rising around her. The letter was from the same professor who had dismissed her inquiry the previous winter. He wrote that he had heard reports from several sources in the Broken Bow area about a method of mulching with buffalo wool that was producing remarkable results. He wrote that he would like to visit her farm, if she would permit it, to observe her methods and document them for a paper he was preparing on soil conservation in the Sandhills. He wrote that he would be arriving in 2 weeks' time. Clara read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She walked out into the garden, past the rows of thriving vegetables, past the gray blanket of wool that had been the source of so much mockery and so much triumph. She knelt down and pushed her finger into the cool, dark soil beneath the wool, and she felt the pulse of the earth, the slow, steady work of roots and water and time. The professor was coming, and Clara Bowen, the widow who had carpeted her turnips, was ready to show him what the discarded things could do. The professor arrived on a Tuesday, as promised, in a buckboard wagon driven by a man from town. He was a thin, bespectacled man in his 50s, with ink stains on his fingers, and a manner of looking at things as if he were measuring them for a diagram. His name was Professor Alden Marsh, and he taught soil science at the Agricultural College in Lincoln. Clara met him at the gate, wiping her hands on her apron, and led him into the garden without ceremony. He walked slowly along the rows, stopping every few feet to kneel and examine the wool, to push his finger into the soil beneath, to lift a corner and peer at the roots. He took notes in a small leather book, the pencil scratching against the paper in quick, impatient strokes. He did not say much at first, only asking an occasional question about the thickness of the wool, the frequency of watering, the type of vegetables planted. Clara answered as plainly as she could, and she watched his face for any sign of mockery or disbelief, but she saw none. What she saw was concentration, the focused attention of a man who was encountering something that did not fit his expectations. After an hour, he straightened up and closed his notebook. "Mrs. Bowen," he said, "I have seen a great many gardens in my career. I have never seen soil like this in the Sandhills. The organic content alone is remarkable. The moisture retention is extraordinary, and the root structure of these plants. I would expect to find this kind of development in a river bottom, not on a sandy rise in the middle of a drought-prone prairie." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest. "It's the wool," she said. "It breaks down slowly, feeds the soil, holds the water, and it keeps the weeds down." Professor Marsh nodded slowly. "Yes, I can see that, but I need to understand the mechanism more precisely. I would like to set up a controlled study, a small plot perhaps, with different thicknesses of wool, and a control plot with no wool at all. I would like to measure the soil temperature, the moisture content, the rate of decomposition. If your method is as effective as it appears, this could be of significant value to farmers throughout the region." Clara agreed, and they spent the rest of the afternoon marking out test plots and discussing the details of the study. The professor was methodical and thorough, and Clara found herself learning from him even as she taught him about the wool. By the time he left, the sun was low, and the garden was bathed in golden light, and Clara felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The professor stayed at the boarding house in town for the next 3 days, coming out to Clara's farm each morning to take measurements and make observations. He examined the soil under the microscope he had brought in his valise, and he took samples of the decomposing wool to analyze in his laboratory. He asked Clara to show him how she had laid the wool for the first time, how she had learned about the method, and she told him about the forest floor in Ohio, about her father's letter, about the summer of mockery. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Mrs. Bowen," he said finally, "the history of agriculture is full of discoveries made by people who were willing to look foolish. The people who laughed at you will be forgotten. Your garden will still be here." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She simply knelt down and showed him how the wool felt when it was properly settled, how the soil beneath it held the moisture even in the heat of the afternoon. On the third day, a late spring frost was forecast. The weather had been warm all week, the kind of deceptive warmth that tricked plants into putting out tender new growth, only to be cut down by a sudden drop in temperature. Clara had seen it happen before, a whole garden blackened overnight, months of work destroyed in a single cold night. She told the professor about the forecast, and he looked at the garden with concern. "Will the wool protect against frost?" he asked. Clara considered. "I don't know," she said. "I've never tested it. But wool is warm. It insulates. It might." That night, Clara spread an extra layer of the loose wool over the most vulnerable plants, tucking it around the stems the way she would tuck a blanket around a child. She did not sleep much. She lay awake, listening to the wind die down and the air grow still, the kind of stillness that came before a hard frost. She went out at midnight, wrapped in her heaviest coat, and looked at the garden in the moonlight. The wool lay pale and still, the plants hidden beneath it. She touched the top of the wool near the tomatoes. It was cool but not cold, and when she pushed her hand through to the soil, the earth was warm, warmer than the air. She went back inside and sat by the stove, waiting for dawn. The sun rose clear and cold, and the frost lay thick on the grass, on the roof of the barn, on the fence posts. The air was sharp and brittle, and Clara's breath hung in white clouds as she walked to the garden. The wool was covered with a crust of frost, the fibers stiff and white. She knelt and lifted a corner of the wool near the tomatoes. The leaves beneath were green, untouched, still firm and healthy. She moved to the beans, the squash, the peppers. All of them were alive, the wool having held the warmth of the earth through the cold night, protecting the plants as if they had been wrapped in a blanket. The bare ground beyond the garden was black with frost, the weeds killed to the ground. Clara stood in the middle of the garden, a faint steam rising from the wool as the sun warmed it, and she felt the tears come. She did not try to stop them. The professor arrived an hour later, his breath puffing, his coat buttoned to the chin. He walked through the garden without speaking, lifting the wool, checking the plants, making notes. When he reached the far end, he turned and looked at Clara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not academic interest, it was wonder. "Mrs. Bowen," he said, "this is remarkable. The temperature differential alone, I would estimate the soil beneath the wool was 10 to 15 degrees warmer than the ambient air last night. The wool acted as a thermal blanket, preventing radiant heat loss. This has implications far beyond drought mitigation. This could extend the growing season by weeks on either end." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I didn't know it would do that," she said. "I was just trying to keep them alive." "That is how most great discoveries are made," the professor said. That afternoon, a meeting was called at the church. The frost had done its damage across the county. Gardens that had been planted in hope were now black and limp, the tender shoots killed by the cold. The families who had not used Clara's wool were facing the loss of their early crops, and the mood in the settlement was grim. The meeting was supposed to be about emergency measures, about how to replant with the shortened season, about shared resources. But when Clara walked in, the room fell silent. She stood at the back, unsure of where to sit, and then Ephraim Abernathy stood up from his seat near the front. He cleared his throat, and the room quieted further. "I have something to say," he said, his voice steady but low. "I have been wrong. Wrong about Mrs. Bowen, wrong about her wool, wrong about the way I treated her last summer." He paused, and Clara saw his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the back of the pew. "I stood on these steps and cast doubt on a method I did not understand. I allowed my pride and my ignorance to harm a good woman's reputation. And I have seen, with my own eyes, that her method works. It worked through the drought. It worked through the fire. It worked through the flood. And last night, it worked through the frost. My garden, which I covered with wool this spring on Mrs. Bowen's instruction, is green this morning. My neighbor's garden, which was bare, is dead. The difference is the wool. The difference is Clara Bowen." He said her name loudly, clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear it. Clara Bowen saw something that the rest of us were too proud to see. She saw worth in what we threw away, and she was right. I apologize to her, publicly, and I hope that the rest of you will join me in thanking her for what she has done for this community." The room was silent for a long moment. Then the widow Doone stood up, and then Lottie Pruitt, and then one by one the others, until the whole congregation was standing, looking at Clara. She stood at the back of the church, and she did not know whether to laugh or cry. She did neither. She simply nodded, once, and the meeting moved on to the business of replanting. But something had changed. The frost had been the final test, and the wool had passed it in front of witnesses. The mockery that had followed Clara through the previous summer was gone, replaced by a respect that she had not asked for and did not quite know how to carry. The professor completed his study and published a paper in the Agricultural Journal. He credited Clara Bowen by name, describing her method in detail and recommending it for use throughout the Sandhills. The railroad, which had been dumping buffalo wool as waste, began to sell it at a modest price, and the settlers came to buy it by the wagon load. Clara's garden became a kind of pilgrimage site. Farmers rode for miles to see it, to ask her questions, to put their own hands into the dark, crumbly soil that the wool had made. She answered their questions patiently, the same questions over and over, because she remembered what it was like to be desperate and alone and looking for an answer. The following spring, Clara Bowen planted her garden as usual, but she did it with a difference. She had saved the best of the wool, the cleanest, the thickest, and she laid it with a care that had become second nature. The soil beneath was so rich now that she could barely recognize it as the same sandy ground she had struggled with for 6 years. It was black and full of life, and when she turned it, she found earthworms in numbers she had never imagined possible. She planted her seeds, watered them in, and covered them with the gray blanket that had become the symbol of her triumph. And then she did something she had never done before. She walked to the edge of the garden, where the old buffalo wool had been worn thin by a year of weather, and she knelt down. She pushed her finger through the wool into the soil beneath, and she felt the cool, dark earth yielding under her touch. She thought of her father, of his letter, of the line that had carried her through the hardest year of her life. She thought of the forest floor in Ohio, the fallen leaves covering the ground, holding the moisture, feeding the earth. She thought of all the things that the world had discarded, the wool, the widow, the woman alone on a hard claim, and she smiled. She rose, brushed off her knees, and went to fetch the seed.